Hello, thank you everybody. I'm really happy to introduce Professor Piazza. I'm really happy that she accepted this invitation. Professor Piazza is a full professor at the CIMeC at the University of Trento. She has been an influential researcher in the field of numerical cognition. She started her studies at the University of Padova, and then she moved to the University College London, where she did her postdoc. And then after that, she did her PhD at the University College London, and then she moved for the postdoc to Paris, where we met. She was spending then a few years there, where she was a researcher. And then she moved to the University of Trento, where she is now. She has been developed her research on numerical cognition, but actually also on semantic processing. So it's I think it's a very interesting way to start this conference, because it gives a very broad view of cognition instead of going into the details. She has been working on numerical cognition, but actually on how numerical cognition relates also to space processing and time processing. And her research has now this very general view of how semantic information is represented in the brain. So I think it's going to be a very, very interesting way to start the conference from the more general and the more general view of how cognitive function is organized. So thank you very much, Manuela, and we're looking forward to your presentation.
Hello, everybody. Thanks, the organizers, of course. I am really thrilled to be here, and I am sure we are going to have a lot of fun in discussing several topics related to the brain in these days. To start, I am going to ask you to imagine yourself in your car or in your bike. It's morning, you just left home, and you're heading toward work. You're using the path that you always take every morning. You know it by heart. You know the turns, the landmarks. But all of a sudden, you realize that the path that you are on is blocked. There are works ongoing. In that right moment, your brain navigational system kicks in importantly. And thanks to the fact that you hold a map-like representation of the space that you know, your neighborhood, your town, you manage to, knowing directions and distances across key location, reorganize your path and take alternative route so that you manage, hopefully, to successfully get to the desired location. In this talk, I am going to try to show the research that I've been doing in my lab during the past years, in which we ask the provocative and maybe counterintuitive question that we humans use this same navigational system that helps us navigating the physical environment also to represent and navigate much more abstract spaces, those of concepts that we held in our memory. In order to start delving into this field, I am going to have to define the concept of cognitive map. This idea was proposed for the first time by the American psychologist Edward Tolman back in the 40s. At that time, the mainstream view in psychology of the mind was that the animal and the human mind could represent pairwise associations between stimulus and response. Edward Tolman was kind of a revolutionary element in that moment because he thought that both animals and humans were able to construct much more complex and abstract representation. In particular, he was studying spatial navigation, and he claimed that we are able to construct internal maps that are global representation of the surrounding environment. Interestingly, however, Tolman himself, even though he was talking about spatial navigation, he was already hinting on the fact that the way in which we represent elements of our experience in our mind may look like map types of representations. So the way in which Tolman demonstrated this important ability that species as simple as rodents, so he had rats as animal model, was by performing this very famous experiment in which he trained rats to navigate a fixed path at the end of which they will always find a reward. This path was presented over and over again up until the rats knew it by heart. At some moment after having training them, however, he presented them with a very different environment in which, after the central arena, not only one path was available, but several different paths were available to the rat. The rats first tried the typical pathway, which is the straight one, and immediately realized that that path was closed. So they had to figure out which of the alternative option they could choose. And to the great surprise, or maybe not, of Tolman and the researchers, they found out that the majority of the rats choose only one of these possible routes, and they choose exactly the route they would have chosen if they were representing a global layout of the environment instead of a sequence of turns, left, front, left, right, and then right. Therefore, out of this experiment, the idea that simple animals are capable of representing global structure of the surrounding environment has been studied also at the level of the neurophysiological underpinnings. And during time, especially using rodent as an animal model, very many different cells, mainly located in hippocampal formation, but also in closely connected regions of the rodent brain, have been shown to code for different aspects of the surrounding environment. Each of these cells display different kind of tuning properties. For the sake of this talk, I am going to concentrate on two types of cells that I will demonstrate, hopefully convincing you, that these kinds of neuronal codes are also involved when we navigate in our abstract thoughts. These are grid cells and head direction cells. Bear with me, the neurophysiologists in the room that know all of this by heart, but I am going to show you this very famous and beautiful video to try to convey what are the properties of the grid cells that were discovered by the couple Moser, for which discovery they, of course, as you well know, got the Nobel Prize. So in this video that I'm going to play, you are going to see the response of a single grid cell recorded in the medial-internal cortex of a rat that is running around a squared arena. Every red dot represented the position in which the rat was when the cell generated action potential, fired. And as you can see, the cell fires when the rat finds himself in different positions. But the positions that activate the cell are not randomly distributed, but they are clusterized and geometrically organized beautifully as if they were located onto edges of equilateral triangles or hexagon that tile the entire surface. So this kind of lattice response constitute a system of coordinates, reminding us the ones that we use to navigate the surface of our planet. And you can clearly intuitively see that these cells are very important to represent distances and directions across landmarks of the environment. So let's imagine two paths that are aligned on the alignment of the grid of an exemplar grid cell. You can clearly see that the length of the path will generate a different number of responses in the cell, such that that cell will fire more when the path is long compared to when it is short. Also, if you compare two paths of different length, but they are either aligned or misaligned on the underlying grid, you will get immediately an information with respect to the direction that the animal was traveling in this different moment in time. Another type of cell that I want to explore a little bit with you is head direction cells, so-called. These are cells that are mainly found, again, in the entorhinal cortex of the rat, but also in the mid-parietal cortex, retrosplenial cortex. These cells do not represent positions in space, but rather heading direction. In this graph, you can see, I don't have a video that would be really too long, there are arrows that represent what was the heading direction of the rat when that particular head direction cell was firing. And as you can see, independently of the position of the rat in the environment, what the cell responds to is the heading direction. And therefore, the same kind of cartoonish representation of the firing field of head direction cell demonstrated that this kind of internal compass that all animals have that indicate what is the direction they're heading does not code for the distance of the traveling path, but encode very nicely and precisely the direction that is that the animal is heading towards. Interestingly, after the first discoveries of this kind of important cell for spatial navigation and for representing the maps of the surrounding space, have been found also in different species, not only rodents, but also several types of mammals. For example, mice, but also macaque monkeys, and more recently, even in humans. With the possibility to record in vivo directly single cell spiking or group of cells in patients with intractable epilepsy most of the time, researchers have been shown that even in the human brain, these kinds of cells exist and exist in high density. For example, head direction cells, similarly to what has been found in the rats, are found in the entorhinal cortex and in the retrosplenial cortex, and also grid cells are also found both in the entorhinal cortex and in humans in the medial prefrontal cortex to a great degree. That is a portion of the cortex that is massively connected with the hippocampal formation and the entorhinal cortex. Okay, so this very short and super simplified version of the spatial navigation system tells us that this system is really evolutionary ancient. It is conserved across species that are very different among each other. It is implemented across species in homologous brain regions, and it is based on neurons that display the similar coding properties across the species. Indeed, thanks to this system, animals are able to orient in space and represent spatial relationships across key elements of the environment. For example, the nest and the food, the self and the nest, or the self and others. So thanks to this system, it is possible for the animal to orient and behave in a way that is very, very crucial for their survival. Okay, but now what I told you in my introduction is that I'm going to tell you that all these neuronal systems are going to be used also for high-level cognition. And indeed, I am going to talk about conceptual representation, but using the term semantics, because as humans represent concept using words that are an element of language, and in the field of psychology and neuroscience, we like to talk about the semantic representations, that are those representations that ultimately correspond to patterns of brain activity that are evoked when we interpret known symbols. And by symbols, I mean elements of language that are arbitrarily associated to concepts. We don't know that much what happens at the neurophysiological level in the brain when we interpret known symbols, therefore when we assess the meaning of the words in our language. But we are starting getting some clue of how this all works. So let's imagine what happens in the brain of an adult skilled reader English speaker when presented with this sequence of strokes, white on a black background. The visual cortex will immediately recognize this shape as a known word, and after few milliseconds, also the auditory cortex will represent the sound that we typically associated with this word, the sound cat. But we also know, and together my lab with many others around the world, that other types of representation are automatically evoked when we read words that we know the meaning of. For example, through the visual cortex, we reactivate the prototypical size, color, and shape of the concept cat. That is all the instances, the average of all the instances of the cats that we have encountered in our life. But also the auditory cortex reinstate the sounds that are associated to this concept. The somatosensory cortex also represents the prototypical feeling that we have when we interact with these type of objects. But also, more crucially maybe, for a real definition of semantic or conceptual representation, we start having a knowledge that the concepts are represented as points in relation to all the other concepts. For example, here, concept cat can be represented as a point in a broad taxonomic tree. So when I talk about relationship and tree, I already kind of hint at space in a sense. Indeed, in the past, researchers that studied semantic representation and tried to understand how we represent the meaning of words have been repeatedly used a spatial metaphor, which had turned out to be a rather powerful heuristic tool to study semantics. According to this metaphor, semantic representation or concepts are conceived as points in a high-dimensional internal space where proximity in this space index the similarity in meaning of a cross-concept. For example, in psychology, already back in the 70s, there has been the idea of semantic networks. In linguistic, the idea of semantic vector space that has been now revived in computational linguistics, whereby linguists conceived semantic representation as vector in high-dimensional space. More recently, this idea has been also tackled by philosophers, and especially Peter Garden, for a philosopher that has been working with neurophysiologists, put forward the idea in a very beautiful text paper, in which really he proposes, theoretically, that maybe this metaphor of space can be supported neurophysiologically, such that we really hold in our brain conceptual spaces where each concept is represented as a point in space. And therefore, in my lab, after this publication was out, we actually had started working in this domain earlier than that, but it was nicely aligned with this proposal because we actually started digging it through experimental approach and try to ask this question, whether the notion of a semantic space can be seen as more than a simple metaphor. Then if you think that concepts are indeed points in a semantic space, then we should see the same neuronal code that are involved in representing space also when we think about concepts. And these neuronal codes need to represent directions, where to go, and also distances, how far to go from one idea to another. And indeed, thanks to the introduction that I have made, these two types of information can be very well encoded through the functioning of these two types of cells, grid cells and head direction cells. So these are the two types of neuronal code that we are going to look for when we ask a subject to think about concepts in their mind. When we started, ideally, we would have started digging into the question by using concepts that are well known by everybody. But that is a very complicated enterprise, because in order to look for grid code or head direction code, we would need to know very well what are the distances and the direction that relate to concepts, for example, that of dog and that of cat. How do we know that? Moreover, semantic spaces are highly dimensional. Why these neuronal code are basically two-dimensional? Because they help animals and humans navigate two-dimensional space, the plane. So the way in which we approached this problem was to build an artificial conceptual space that we trained our subject on. So in this experiment, we presented our adult healthy subjects with a series of audiovisual stimuli that were presented as animals of different types. And the stimuli that we presented were generated by a unique combination of size that could vary parametrically and a pitch that they would produce during a small animation video. Once acquainted with all these elements, we told our subjects that this animal could be divided into 4 species, and each species could be named with a different term. And we used novel words that were not meaningful for the subject before the training: dal, dan, gal, keren, moss. We trained the subjects to parse the stimulus space using these terms and to categorize each of these objects with the correct categorical name. Here is an example of how we performed our training. Of course, we never show a geometrical organization of the object, but we just presented one after the other to our subject. So here on the screen you have a sentence saying, "The following objects are exemplars of care." This is what we said to subjects. Smallish and producing a low pitch. These are moss. Biggish and producing a low pitch sound. These are dun, small with a high pitch sound, etc., etc. So you get the point. What we did here is to constructing an artificial object space that is parsed into categories using symbols. And we think that these are the minimal requirement to say that we are talking about a semantic space. We had the subject coming in the scanner before undergoing this training, and we presented the words in sequence and sometimes intermingled with the object themselves. We trained them after 7 days of training. The ability to categorize the object were consolidated, and then we put them in the scanner again, presenting the same pseudo-random sequence of objects and especially words. And we reasoned that this sequential presentation of objects and words could be conceived as a path in their internal semantic space. So every path, meaning every subsequent perception of words and object, could be defined as having a particular distance and a particular direction. So, for example, when reading the word gal after the word moss, the path that subjects are doing, metaphorically, but maybe not, is short compared to the path that they are doing when the word gal is preceding the word care, etc., etc. So to look for a distance code in the brain, is the brain representing these paths in terms of their distance? We contrasted all the bold signals in response to words that were preceded by words that were close or far away in the semantic space. We did so using 2 kinds of approaches, fMRI adaptation and multivoxel pattern analysis, and both analytical approaches demonstrated that the ventromedial prefrontal cortex, that I remind you is being demonstrated to host a great deal of grid cells, is representing semantic distance when subjects simply are processing these novel words that now are meaningful because we train them to be meaningful. Indeed, then, we use multidimensional scaling, that is a statistical technique that can reveal the hidden structure in the data basing on the pattern of mutual similarities across the stimuli, and using the neural activation in the ventromedial prefrontal cortex, we see that while before training all the objects result in a mutual relation that is not very meaningful, and indeed these words didn't mean anything before training to subject, after training, the geometrical organization that results from the multidimensional scaling resembles closely the geometrical organization of our stimuli that we trained our subjects on. Then we were looking not only for a distance code, but also for a directional code. And in order to do so, we, of course, in our experiment, we could sample 8 directions. And in order to do so, we refer to the seminal work of Christian Doeller, who for the first time demonstrated that we can use the bold signal to infer a grid-like code that is probably generated by the presence of grid cells that respond massively together. In his seminal work, Doeller had the subject in the scanner navigating a virtual reality, a physical space, and he based his reasoning on the fact that grid cells are organized with an hexagonal geometry, and therefore, they tend to be, for every individual, oriented in the prototypical direction. And he predicted that every time a subject is moving in a direction that is aligned to the underlying grid, the bold signal should be high, while for movement directions that are not aligned on the underlying grid, the bold signal should be low. And indeed, this is what he found. He found a 6-fold periodicity in the bold signal as a function of all the random direction in every moment that subjects were taking when they were navigating, such that directions that differ by a multiple of 60 degrees show a very similar intensity in the bold signal. We started from this seminal work and changed a little bit our approach. Instead of analyzing single voxel individually, we adopted a multivariate approach, and we used the representational similarity analysis that looks not at a single direction, but at a pattern of neuronal pattern differences across different directions. So according to our approach, we constructed a model for which 2 directions that are, I remind you, simple 2 words presented one after the other. These are in our model a direction. If 2 directions differ by a multiple of 60 degrees, their pattern of brain activity should be very similar. While as 2 directions are not completely aligned on this 60-degree rotational space, their difference in activation should scale with the angular distance in the 60-degree space. So to give you an example, these 2 directions here are predicted to have a high similarity in the neuronal activation because they differ by 180 degrees, which is a multiple of 60. While, for example, these 2 directions differ by 90 degrees, and therefore we predicted that the brain will respond to these 2 directions in a way that is very different. So, with this model, we looked for where and if in the brain there were voxels that confirmed to this behavior and therefore responded with a grid-like pattern. And indeed, we found that the right entorhinal cortex was the only region that was activated according to a grid-like model. Indeed, when we plot activity in this region, we show that the neural pattern dissimilarity across direction was modulated by the angular distance in the space. We also show that before training, when all these novel words didn't mean anything to subject, the ventromedial entorhinal cortex did not correlate with the grid-like model. Also, we did the same kind of reconstruction of the geometry of the space using neural data in entorhinal cortex and showed that while before training there was no meaningful structure, after training the words were responded to with an arrangement that resemble the one of the semantic space that we had injected into the people's mind and brain eventually. So, in this first study was the first attempt of us to find out whether we could uncover some spatial code or grid and distance and direction code while subject assess the meaning of words. And we did find some of this evidence. However, if you have some basic notion of math and geometry, you will realize by yourself that this study had an important limitation, especially in revealing grid-like code. Because we had too few movement direction to firmly determine, we only have 4 points, to firmly determine that our directional signal really followed a 6-fold and not a 2-fold modulation. Indeed, the two models, 6-fold grid-like and 2-fold not grid-like, gave the same prediction. Therefore, we overcome this problematic aspect of the study by running a similar one, but that made use of many more words and therefore many more items. Here, we adopted the same approach, but we didn't scan subject before training. We just went straight into the training. We taught subject to recognize and name using novel non-words to label these multisensory objects. And we asked them to recognize them, to produce their name, and also to compare them through a semantic comparison. So, for example, we presented the word pad and the tib and asked them to decide which one was associated to a bigger object. It is a task that you can do in general psychology, asking subject whether a cat or a mouse is a bigger animal. This is really the same that we are doing here, semantic comparison tasks. Differently from the past study, we presented words only and not object in the scanner. So subject lied in the scanner and looked at pairs of words in a sequence, after which there was a pause and another pair of words could appear. Very rarely, we probed them with a question that was related to a semantic comparison. So every once in a while, we asked them, was the second word related to an object that was bigger or smaller compared to the preceding one, or an object that made a higher or a lower pitch? Okay, so here, the first thing that we did here is, if you remember when I was talking to you about what we know about how the brain represents semantics, I briefly mentioned the fact that the individual dimension or features of the objects that the word referred to are reinstated in those brain regions that are activated by those features. So, for example, when you read the word cat, in your brain, the visual cortex represents the average shape of the cat. Can we show exactly the same thing in this artificial environment? So here we look for the response to size by looking at a distance effect on the dimension size. So we search for whether there are in the brain regions that encode the different names as a function of how far they are in the semantic space with respect to the dimension size, irrespective to the dimension pitch. And what we found is that only one patch in the occipital, in the visual cortex, is indeed modulated by size. Indeed, you can see that the activation is very low when the distance is 0. So these two objects, for example, that are identical in size. It's a little bit higher when the distance is 1, for example, this one, and higher again when the distance is 2. Importantly, in this region, there is no code for pitch. We did the other way around, and we look for whether in the brain there are regions that, when subjects look at words, respond in a way that is proportional to the sound that has been associated during training to these words. And we found that the distance code is present in the superior temporal cortex, in the vicinity of the auditory cortex. And again, there was no effect of size. But what we are interested in here, in the center of our interest, is a code that is bidimensional. And so we were trying to find a distance code in the two-dimensional space. Here, because we have very many more words, we could sample many more dimensions, and we looked for brain regions that encoded proportionally the stimuli according to the relative distance in the semantic space. And we replicated the first observation that the ventromedial prefrontal cortex encoded the relative distances across concepts when presented to subjects in terms of words. We also perform exactly the same grid representational similarity analysis. Here we had many more sampled directions, and we approach the question using region of interest, but also a searchlight analysis. And what we compared with the region of interest were the left and the right entorhinal cortex, and we found that there was a correlation with the predicted grid-like model in the right but not in the left entorhinal cortex, which is the same as we found in the previous experiment. And we show the same feature. The dissimilarity in the pattern of evoked brain activity are modulated by the angular distance in the 60-degree space across all the directions. And we also show that other control periodicity don't explain the result. Crucially, we confirm that the right entorhinal cortex does activate in a way that conforms to the grid-like model by looking at the entire brain. The only region that correlated with the hexadirectional model was the right entorhinal cortex. I told you about the existence of another neuronal code at the beginning that is the code of absolute heading direction. I refer to grid code as a directional code because indeed one grid cell responds in the same way when the animal goes in a certain direction, but also in multiple of 60 degrees of that direction. While head direction cells prefer single direction. So this is why we say that head direction cells really give you a compass-like response and indicate exactly the direction that an animal is heading towards. Can we imagine that those head direction cells also are activated when subjects navigate in this semantic space? And in order to ask these questions, we used fMRI adaptation, and we reasoned that every time the same direction is implied by pairs of different words that are presented to subject, then the bold activity in the regions that encode absolute direction should decrease. So, for example, if I present these two words one after the other, and then I present these two words one after the other, the two imply the same direction, and therefore the response of this pair should be reduced compared to the condition where this pair is preceded by another pair of words that imply a different direction. And we further tested the fact that we predicted that the amount of fMRI adaptation should be proportional to how close in time the same direction is proposed to the subject. Therefore, we looked for where in the brain there is this absolute directional signal when subjects navigate a semantic space, and we find a bunch of regions, including, importantly, regions in the mid-parietal cortex, such as the precuneus, but also the retrosplenial cortex that, I remind you, in animals, but also in humans, have been shown to host head direction cells. Also, interestingly, these regions, the amount of adaptation that these regions show, and therefore directionally based, were correlated with the performance of subject, how well subjects are able to relate all these concepts to one another. So as a first conclusion out of these studies, I can say that with this experiment, we demonstrated that the semantic representations and their relation are encoded through distance-based, grid-like, and absolute directional neuronal code, and that these responses are to be found in brain regions that typically are involved in spatial navigation, such as entorhinal, ventromedial, and retrosplenial cortex. Therefore, this seen in such a perspective of cortical recycling, this result can be seen as an example of cortical recycling, where the neuronal machinery that probably has primarily evolved in lower level animals to represent the relationship between spatial location and therefore represent and navigate map, can be reused to represent the relation between a concept in an abstract representational space of meaning. However, one must consider that this is not the only interpretation of the results that can be put forward. Indeed, an alternative interpretation that is not that radically alternative but slightly different is not to think as this brain navigation system as primarily being a brain navigation system, but rather to think that these kinds of brain systems and neurons that we observe historically first being involved in navigation actually are capable of a very general computation that is that of encoding relational information and constructing structural representation. And this kind of computations are very important when you want to abstract away a map, when you navigate space, but they are also very important when you want to abstract away a structure of your own experience. So in this sense, I want to refer to the very beautiful work done by the team led by Tim Behrens in Oxford in the UK, where he studies a lot the involvement of this so-called navigation system, in particular the entorhinal cortex, in the abstraction of structure out of the sensory experience. In one beautiful experiment of his, he's scanning his first training subjects by presenting them images, one after the other, that are presented, however, not in a random order, but are taken as random walks on a very predetermined graph, such as two images can be presented one after the other in the sequence only if they are connected through an edge. After having trained them with this sequence, pseudo-random sequence, in the second day, they put subject in the scanner. And now they show these images randomly, in random sequence, and they measure how the brain reacts to these images in a way in which, and they try to see whether the brain has changed the way in which it reacted to the stimuli in order to represent the structural form that they were presented on. And indeed, when they looked for which brain region responded to the link distance between the images, so more similarly when the two objects are presented close, and more differently when the two objects are not linked directly, he found precisely the right entorhinal cortex. And when they perform multidimensional scaling on the pattern of brain activity in this region, they could uncover precisely the shape, the geometrical arrangement of the item, because I forgot to tell you that during the scanner, he didn't show the entire set of stimuli, but only a subset. And therefore, through the activity of the entorhinal cortex, they could uncover the structure of the graph that subjects were trained with. So we did something similar, but in the semantic space, thinking about that through language, we can represent our environment using different kinds of structures. For example, we use lines to represent numbers or natural integers. circles to represent the color wheels, but most of the time we use nested hierarchical structure, for example, to represent the taxonomy of our environment. When we see two dogs, we can name that as pit bull and bulldog, or we can name them as dog, or as mammals, or as animals, or as living things. So our language is inherently constructed through hierarchical nested representations. And so we ran an experiment in which we try to teach a subject implicitly to build a nested representation. And we looked at which brain region changed their coding and their response such that they represented these nested trees. The experiment was very similar to the one I presented initially, so there were different visual auditory objects that were presented to subject, but contrary to the first experiment, when we trained subject, we not only told them that each object could be related to one family. So, for example, this one object, very small with a low pitch, we told subject, this is called care, and then they learned it. But we also told them, this is also called TIB. And these TIB and VIG represent the subordinate categories that grouped together pairs of families. So we hoped that by this associative learning subject, if it is true that we systematically and spontaneously construct maps of the stimuli, would mentally construct hierarchical trees relating all these words together. So we had them in the scanner and measured their brain activity when we presented these words in pseudo-random order without having to do any kind of task. How to create a hierarchical tree via changing the similarity in which the brain responds to the different words? Well, first of all, we can predict that the superordinate words will become in the brain more similar to each of their corresponding subordinate words. But also, we can imagine that the subordinate words will become more similar to each other compared to how similar they are to any other words. So we looked for where in the hippocampal formation these kinds of code, similarity within level and cross-level similarity are represented through representational similarity analysis. And what we found by looking at the posterior hippocampus, mid, anterior, and entorhinal cortex, that only the entorhinal cortex represented both a high cross-level similarity, so superordinate words are encoded very similarly to subordinate words, but also high level of subordinate level similarity. Words that belong to the same superordinate cluster are represented as very similar. Indeed, when we take the activation of the entorhinal cortex and we use multidimensional scaling, we end up seeing that the subordinate words are represented differently from each other and very close to the subordinate words that they contain for both the two superordinate categories. We can also use a hierarchical clustering as a visualization tool, and we show that the subordinate words are clustered together and next to their relative superordinate words. So the pattern, or the way in which the brain, after having undergone this training, represent these novel words reflects precisely the way in which subjects were taught they related to the object that they represent. And therefore, we are witnessing the creation of hierarchical trees after short training, and we're witnessing the fact that these medial temporal areas, and in particular the entorhinal cortex, is actually capable of representing this kind of abstract information. So with this work, I show you the first attempt to explore the question of how semantic representation are emerge as the product of the activity of our brain. and that there are regions, especially in the medial temporal lobe and closely correlated areas, that are very crucial for holding such abstract representation of knowledge. But there are very many open questions. First of all, and importantly, the material that we used was highly artificial. Can we replicate these results using common words and concepts? It's going to be very difficult because we don't know a priori what are the first important dimensions that hold the semantic space. Second, the relative distances and directions in them. What about multidimensional spaces? We know that we represent objects according to very many different dimensions, and therefore, how does the brain approach the question of multidimensional semantic spaces? While these neuronal codes are relative to planes where animal navigates and therefore are two-dimensional. There are at least two alternatives that I can see. One is that we operate cognitive compression, that is, in every moment in time, even though we have the impression that we can hold very complex semantic representation, we actually can focus only on a couple of maybe 3 dimensions at a time. And this is a question that we can ask using, for example, magnetoencephalography and see whether this shifting in very, very low dimensional subspaces of the semantic space is actually something that occurs. But also it is possible that the brain hosts multidimensional neurons representational codes that we have not discovered yet. So we are in the middle of this path. As final remarks, I want to say that I think that this line of research indicating that space processing and abstract thinking are closely related, to me at least, is really fascinating. And I think that it can open up new avenues for better understanding with a clinical approach the neurocognitive underpinning of neurological diseases that are linked to the degeneration of the medial temporal lobes, for example, Alzheimer's disease or semantic dementia. Some future directions that we are exploring in our lab currently is to first characterize the development of the brain navigation system during the first months and years of life using EEG. And also we want to probe, despite the role in abstraction of structural form, whether these circuits are also important for inference, reasoning, and metaphor processing, which we suspect they will do. If we haven't realized it yet, I have wrote in red some keywords here. And I invite you to think that these keywords are words that are related to space. And it is interesting to think that in our language, we massively use spatial metaphor when we refer to abstract concept. And this may not be something that is by chance. So with this, I thank you for your attention, my great young collaborators, and the funding agencies that is giving me money for doing this research. I hope that you will have questions and that we can engage in interesting conversation. Thank you.
Yeah, I think we can. Thanks a lot for this fascinating talk. We have now a few minutes for questions. Yes?
Please, yes.
So do you think that maybe the very same cells that receive neurons are coding for space?
I think so. Of course, it's an empirical question whether there are subclustering or whether the same neurons in different groups, in different kinds of organization are key for both abilities. But I wouldn't be surprised if it turned out that the same cell may have some properties related to the physical space and show the same properties when probed with more abstract input information. For example, boundary cell may also are something that are really also interesting, and I think that people are studying. Whenever we think about a domain, we have boundaries in mind. And therefore, do we also use the same kinds of neural representation? Maybe. It is possible. I really don't know. It is an empirical question. At the level of the single neuron, I don't know. But I wouldn't be shocked. Wow, good.
Yeah, thanks so much for this beautiful talk. I have a question. So in this mapping you have presented, how much space is there for individual differences, subjective experiences, cultural differences? Does the first research direction into development address that somehow?
Oh, this is a really beautiful question. We have, as you have seen, real data analyzed to the end, 3 experiments so far, and the only thing we tried is to have a correlation with respect to the adaptation effect in the retrosplenial cortex and the sensitivity or the ability of people to construct these categories. I have to say that other than that, we really don't know much. What I can tell you is that we always question people at the end of training whether or not they have an introspection of having created explicit maps that are visual and that are 2-dimensional or whatever they want. And the answer is no, actually. People don't realize, and maybe they don't actually have the knowledge of having used these spatial codes. And maybe these codes are not spatial indeed. So, it's a really complicated, maybe philosophical question, but people they don't have introspection on that. But for example, there are other fields in which we study how space is important to represent concept, which is the field of numbers. In that case, we know much more, and we have performed very many experiments in which it is clear that cross-culturally, we have a recent study where we tested the Himba population, an African group in Namibia that is entirely oral, so have no number lines, have no reading or writing direction that is imposed from the culture, and all of them, if you give them chips with the dots and ask them to organize them on the table as beautifully as they can, the majority of them order them in line. That can be oriented left to right or right to left, but there is a prepotent use of the linear organization for a semantic field that is inherently unidimensional as number, but also time. So culture are typically using space when representing time, even though the directionality of these vectors changes. Somebody goes left to right, somebody back to front. But there is a lot of work in inter-individual differences across cultures in this sense, and they all point to some kind of regularity. So to the idea that this mapping between meaning and space is really universal.
Okay. Well, super exciting talk, so congratulations. So my question is a general question. So memorizing is better while navigating?
Can I have my slides on, please? Yeah. So you probably know about the method of Loci. This was a method that was first told by the Latin philosopher Cicerone. And it was a method for memorizing new information. And this method is used a lot nowadays. And it is a method by which you imagine a palace. It's also called the memory palace. You imagine a place that you know very well, and you attribute each piece of knowledge to a specific location in this place. And in order to retrieve the knowledge, you imagine yourself going throughout this place. And I wonder whether the research that we are doing now, not only in my group, of course, there is a huge amount of people working on this topic, is actually point at this very reason for this method to be so helpful. Because we ground our representation within the same neuronal spaces and using the same neuronal machinery that we use to navigate space. So potentially, yes, it is true. When we explicitly use spatial strategies to memorize and to organize information, we retain that information better. All the maps that children nowadays use to study, etc., all boil down to this same idea that mixing together space and whatever you want to think of or remember is actually rather helpful. Yes.
Thank you. It was a fascinating talk indeed. Thank you very much. And my question is related to the fact if we can apply these circuits to the navigation of emotions or in terms of empathy. And a second question, that you have talked many times about the right entorhinal cortex. Is there a laterality known thing, or it's unknown?
Yes, those are very fascinating questions, both of them. As for emotions, I don't know, but I think that we should be able absolutely to apply the same logic for the space of emotion, which is maybe circular, maybe it's linear. I mean, there is debate on how it is organized. I have a colleague who is studying this same question of representing structure by not only using non-invasive brain imaging techniques, but also by looking at where people look at when they think about concept. And this is an indirect evidence of the underlying neuronal representation. And interestingly, what he has found when studying emotion is that they seem to be organized in the same wheel, so in the circular internalized space as colors. And they can also be aligned easily from subject to subject, such that not necessarily all subjects align colors and emotion in the same way, but those have some kind of correspondence. So this is a very general answer, but I really think that instead of these stimuli would use emotional words, maybe we would find ourselves in a easier or maybe intermediate case in between just the whole semantic and very artificial words that we've used. This is a great idea. Thank you very much. The second question is, yes, lateralization. We don't understand this. Using other paradigms that are similar to this one, people have tried to have revealed the presence of grid cells when people navigate the space of their friends or the space of their neighbors. There has been research like that. And again, even when looking at pictures of your friends, you can recover grid-like signature with respect to how close they are to you, etc., etc. And sometimes they find the left entorhinal cortex, sometimes they find the right entorhinal cortex as well. So there is not a strong agreement in the literature. We, to be honest, would have expected the left entorhinal cortex to be more involved because we are dealing with words, with something that is related to language, which we know is mostly left lateralized. But in all our studies, we find the right entorhinal cortex. We don't understand why.
Thank you.
Last.
I think this should be the last one.
Oh, yeah. Okay. Thank you. Thank you very much. So I find that this is a fascinating topic indeed, and a rather more speculative question connecting the healthy brain with the artificial brain. So to my rather limited understanding, it is my understanding that transformer models like ChatGPT actually work by mapping a high-dimensional latent space and then doing vector operations inside that space to connect concepts. And so my question would be, would this situation that we are finding ourselves now with the AI revolution be a kind of convergent evidence that this kind of mapping in a high-dimensional space for cognition, maybe in visual, emotional, language, auditory spaces? So this is a thing that was selected by evolutionary pressure, and we are also finding it by other means in the AI, in the training of the AI that is taking place in the laboratories.
I understand your question. It's hard to answer that for me. because I really think that in this sense we are talking about a really completely different mechanism. First of all, I don't have a deep understanding of how these models are trained really, apart from a superficial intuition, and therefore it's hard for me to speculate, but what I know for sure is that the kind of coding schemes that are present in the brain and with which we have to do when we represent the meaning of things and we construct a structure is something that is currently not present in the artificial neural networks that are not organized using this predetermined type of response. Of course, they look at co-occurrences and proximities in high-dimensional spaces, but this is not quite exactly the same as having directional code or grid-like code that we do have in the brain. And actually, maybe it would be possible to approximate even more the way in which those systems simulate the human mind by having them using these kinds of coding schemes by default, having them representing information in this kind of way, which I don't think is the case yet. Apart from the case of physical navigation, in which I have an expert here to which we are going to have to ask the question, but I think that if an artificial neural network that have to perform navigation are embedded with grid-like representations to start with, their navigational performance outperforms that is done without the presence of this kind of grid-like code. So it's a if I understand correctly that literature, it's a sign that even for semantic and therefore for language model, it might be useful to use this kind of codes as well in setting up the networks. Okay, thank you very much.